The truck came back in the dark. Eleanor heard it before she saw it. The low groan of the diesel engine pulling hard against the grade of the county road, the creak of the borrowed livestock trailer on the gravel curve below the equipment shed. She had been standing at the south gate of the upper pasture for 20 minutes in the September cold waiting. The sky above Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, had not yet made up its mind between night and morning. The ryegrass was wet. Her breath came in small visible clouds above the fence line. The Holstein herd was still in the barn. The barn was dark except for the single yellow bulb above the milking parlor door that she left burning every night from September through April, the way Norman had left it burning for the 26 years before her. She unlatched the gate and walked down the slope to the gravel yard. Her son Daniel was standing in the doorway of the milking parlor with his work coat half-buttoned, holding a lantern. He had heard the truck too. He was 22 years old, and he had the lean, watchful look of a young man who has grown up doing serious work and has learned from that work to wait before he speaks. He said nothing. He watched his mother cross the gravel yard in the September dark, with her boots leaving prints in the wet grass at the edge of the drive, and his lantern throwing a long orange shadow behind her. Eleanor backed the trailer to the loading ramp herself. She had been doing it alone for 4 years, and she had gotten good at it. She learned the particular geometry of the borrowed rig in the summer, the way it wanted to track left on gravel, the way the rear axle complained in the cold. She cut the engine. She set the brake. She walked around to the rear of the trailer and pulled the ramp pins. The ramp came down with a sound like a dropped board on still water, and the sound rolled out across the dark pasture and came back faint from the tree line on the far side of the lower field. The first animal came off the ramp slowly. It tested each step with the deliberate forward-leaning caution of a creature that has been in a trailer for many hours and is not certain what the ground beneath the ramp will do. It paused at the bottom. It lifted its wide, flat head and held it still for a moment in the dark air, reading the smell of the Lancaster County pasture, the ryegrass, the October mud, the old Holstein smell baked into the barn boards, the particular mineral cold of a Pennsylvania autumn. It was not a Holstein. It was not a Jersey. It was not a brown Swiss, or an Ayrshire, or any breed of cow Daniel Whitfield had ever seen on this farm, or on any farm in Lancaster County, in his 22 years of life. It was large and low-shouldered, the color of slate going dark in rain, with a wide, flat forehead and horns that swept back and outward in a long, slow, confident curve that belonged to a different continent and a different century than the one Daniel was standing in. Its eyes were amber. Its hooves were wide and careful and left deep, clean impressions in the wet gravel at the base of the ramp. The second came, then the third, then the fourth and fifth and sixth. They moved in a single careful line from the ramp to the gate, their hooves making a sound on the gravel that was different from any cattle sound Daniel had ever heard, lower, more deliberate, more patient, as if each footfall had been considered before it was placed. The last of the 6, a young bull with a neck like a river bend and a horn sweep wider than the others, paused at the base of the ramp for a long moment and looked out across the dark pasture before he stepped off. He looked at it the way a man looks at a room he has been told about his whole life and is now entering for the first time. Daniel stood in the milking parlor doorway with the lantern and did not speak. He watched all 6 animals walk through the gate and into the lower pasture. He watched his mother latch the gate behind them. He watched her stand at the fence line for a long moment with her hand on the top rail, looking at the herd in the dark. The 6 animals moved out into the pasture grass and lowered their heads and began to graze, as though they had been grazing this same field every morning of their lives. The young bull crossed toward the far fence. The 3 heifers stayed together near the gate. The 2 dry cows moved slowly east toward the upper slope, their slate-gray backs dark against the paler darkness of the pre-dawn sky. Eleanor turned around. Daniel looked at her across the gravel yard. The lantern threw the light upward into his face and left his chin in shadow. He said, "Mother, what are these?" Eleanor said, "These are what your great-grandmother carried across the Atlantic in her mind in 1898. We are going to make her cheese." She walked past him into the milking parlor. Daniel stood at the gate alone for another full minute in the cold morning dark, holding the lantern, watching 6 Italian Mediterranean water buffalo graze quietly on the Whitfield home place for the first time in its 100-year history. The young bull had reached the far fence line and stood with his head up facing east toward the dark tree line, perfectly still in the pre-dawn, as if he were listening for something that had not yet arrived. Daniel did not know what to say, so he said nothing. He hung the lantern on the nail above the parlor door. He buttoned his work coat the rest of the way. He went in to start the Holstein milking. His mother was already at work. The home place sat on 40 rolling acres of Lancaster County farmland, 3 miles west of the town of Birchfield. Norman Whitfield had farmed it from 1948 until November of 1974, when he died of a heart attack in the milking parlor at the age of 51 on a Wednesday afternoon in the last week of the month, on a day that had been, by every external measure, a completely ordinary day. He had been cleaning the milking cluster with the long-handled brush he kept on the hook above the wash vat when he went down. The hired man, a quiet older fellow named Gus Pelter, had found him at 4 in the afternoon and had driven to the farmhouse at a run. Eleanor had called the doctor from the kitchen telephone. The doctor had arrived at 4:40. Norman had died, the doctor told her, sometime between 3 and 3:30. Eleanor had been sitting at the kitchen table when the doctor told her this. She had looked at the clock above the stove. She had nodded. She had asked 2 practical questions about what happened next. She had not cried until after the doctor left, and the kitchen was quiet again, and she was alone at the table with his coffee cup still on the counter, from that morning still holding the ring of dried brown at the bottom from the last cup he had poured. She had been 37 years old. Norman Whitfield had been born on the home place in 1923. His own father had been born there in 1901. The family had homesteaded the original 40-acre section in 1879, with 8 Holstein cows brought up from a Berks County breeder and a 2-room farmhouse that had since been expanded twice. Norman had taken over the operation from his father in 1948 when the old man's knees gave out, and he had farmed it for 26 years with a methodical, undemonstrative competence that the county recognized without ever quite saying so aloud. He had been a 4th-generation Lancaster County Holstein dairyman. He had known what he was doing, and he had done it without complaint. He had not opposed Eleanor's grandmother Vera's water buffalo dreams. He had not encouraged them either. He had told Eleanor in the autumn of 1972, 2 years before he died, that whatever she wanted to do with the operation after he was gone was her business. He had said it once at the kitchen table in the same quiet, unhurried tone he used for all important statements, and he had not said it again because he was not a man who repeated himself, and because he knew Eleanor was not a woman who needed things repeated. He had been buried in the Birchfield Lutheran Cemetery on the 3rd Saturday of November, 1974, in a service attended by 62 people from the county and by his pastor in a long black wool coat, and by Eleanor and Daniel, and by Eleanor's mother, Adelheid, who had been in the Worcester nursing home since 1971, and who had been driven to the service by the nursing home's Sunday transport driver, and who wept quietly throughout and had to be helped back to the transport van afterward by 2 of the women from the church. Eleanor had walked away from the graveside at 23 minutes after 3 in the afternoon, with Daniel beside her, and no clear sense of what she would do next. Not because she did not know what to do. She had always known what to do. She had known since she was 6 years old on a summer evening on a farmhouse porch in Lancaster County, listening to an old woman who had crossed an ocean and lost everything she carried except 1 sentence and 7 wooden molds and 3 sealed jars of living culture and a recipe book that went back to 1812. She had known. She had simply not yet decided when. Eleanor's mother's people were Italian, settled in Lancaster County from the Lombardy region of northern Italy in the late 1890s, as part of a small agricultural community of immigrants from the Alpine foothills above Milan. Her grandmother Vera Bonetti had come across on a steerage passage in the late summer of 1898 at the age of 14 as part of a wave of Lombard emigrants who had been recruited to Lancaster County by a labor agent working on behalf of a consortium of Pennsylvania farm operators who needed seasonal workers for the apple and tobacco harvests. Vera had grown up in a village outside Milan on a small holding her family had worked for 3 generations. The family kept 3 Mediterranean water buffalo for milk. The buffalo milk went in the traditional method of the Lombard plain into fresh mozzarella di bufala, made in the family's stone-floored cheese room, where the wooden molds and the clay starter cultures and the stretched curd technique had been passed from grandmother to mother to daughter for as long as anyone in the family could remember. The cheese went to the village market and to the 2 restaurants in the nearest town, and to the larger households in the surrounding area that could afford it. The port of entry inspectors at Castle Garden in New York Harbor had refused to allow the 3 water buffalo to cross the steerage line. They had been held in a quarantine pen on the dock while Vera and the other immigrants from her group had been processed through. She had watched from the processing hall window as the animals were led away. She had been 14 years old. She had not cried in the processing hall because the women around her were watching, and she had been told by her mother before she left that she was old enough to carry herself like a woman in America. She had cried later on the ferry crossing the harbor when the New York skyline came into view, and she understood for the first time the full weight of what she had left behind. She had not been allowed to bring the animals. She had been allowed to bring everything else. Tied into the bottom of her steerage trunk with hemp twine wrapped in cloth and packed in straw, and carried 4,000 miles across an ocean, 7 hand-carved wooden mozzarella molds her own great-grandfather, Tommaso Bonetti, had cut from a single block of Italian alder in the autumn of 1879. 3 clay starter culture jars, sealed with beeswax, and labeled in her grandmother Lucia Bonetti's old Italian cursive. A handwritten family recipe book in Italian containing 47 cheese recipes dated back to 1812. The oldest ones written in a hand so old the letter forms had to be sounded out syllable by syllable. A single square of hand-loomed cheesecloth her great-grandmother Filippa Bonetti had woven on the family loom in 1840, and 1 sentence carried not in the trunk, but in Vera's mouth, where it had been placed by her own grandmother Lucia on the morning of Vera's departure, to be carried across the ocean and passed forward in the new country to the daughters and granddaughters who would come after. The sentence was this: "Granddaughter, when the American market is ready for real mozzarella, the day will come when our family will need water buffalo again." Vera Bonetti had arrived in Lancaster County in the autumn of 1898 with the 7 molds and the 3 clay jars and the recipe book and the cheesecloth square and the sentence, and with no water buffalo and no way to get any, and no market in Lancaster County for fresh mozzarella di bufala, even if she had been able to make it. She had settled. She had worked the apple harvest. She had married a Lombard man named Enrico Bonetti, who had come across in the same wave and who had eventually taken a position at a Lancaster ironworks, and had moved the family to a house in Birchfield, where Vera had kept a small kitchen garden and raised 3 children and made for the families of the small Lombard community in the surrounding area quantities of fresh mozzarella and other Italian cheeses using cow's milk, and her grandmother's wooden molds and her grandmother's recipes and her grandmother's starter cultures, refreshed every 6 months without interruption from the original 1898 jars. Vera Bonetti had told her daughter Adelheid the sentence. Adelheid had told Eleanor. Eleanor had heard it first at the age of 6 on the back porch of her grandmother's house in Birchfield in the summer of 1937, in the particular flat, late afternoon light of a Pennsylvania summer, sitting on the porch step with a glass of water while her grandmother worked at the small kitchen garden along the porch wall. Vera had stopped hoeing and had looked at Eleanor for a moment without speaking. Then she had said the sentence. Eleanor had repeated it back. Vera had nodded once and returned to the hoeing. Eleanor had heard the sentence again at 10 and again at 14, and twice more before Vera Bonetti died in March of 1962, at the age of 77, in the same Birchfield house, where Eleanor had spent every childhood summer with the 7 wooden molds and the 3 clay jars and the handwritten recipe book still in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Those objects had passed to Eleanor's mother, Adelheid. Adelheid had passed them to Eleanor in 1971 when she had moved into the nursing home. Eleanor had set the cedar chest in the basement of the Whitfield farmhouse and had not opened it again until the winter of 1977. She opened it in January of 1977, 3 years after Norman died, on a night when the temperature had dropped to 6 degrees and the wind was coming from the northwest, and the Holstein barn was making its particular January sound of cold wood contracting in the dark. She had carried the chest up from the basement to the kitchen table and had sat down with a cup of coffee and untied the hemp twine and lifted the lid. The molds were at the top, wrapped in the old cheesecloth. She lifted each one and turned it over in her hands. They were made of Italian alder, and they were worn smooth from 90 years of handling their interior surfaces, darkened to amber from decades of contact with fresh mozzarella. They fit her hands in a way she had not expected, not uncomfortable, not strange, but specific, as though the wood had been shaped by hands like hers. The clay jars were below the molds, still sealed with beeswax. The beeswax cracked at the edges, but intact. The cursive on the labels was in Italian, in her great-great-grandmother Lucia's old hand, faded to brown, but legible. Eleanor could not read old Italian cursive. She sat with the jars for a long time anyway. The recipe book was at the bottom, wrapped in a separate piece of cloth. It was small, about the size of a day planner, bound in brown leather that had dried and cracked at the spine. Eleanor opened it carefully. The pages were thin and had foxed at the edges to the color of old tea. The handwriting inside changed twice, 3 different hands across the 47 recipes, the oldest entries at the back of the book, the newest at the front, covering a period from 1812 to approximately the 1890s. She read the mozzarella recipe 3 times. Then she read it again. She closed the book. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the coffee going cold and the wind making its particular noise against the north kitchen window and the Holstein barn making its cold wood sound in the dark field beyond the glass. She had been reading about water buffalo for 4 months before she opened the chest. She had read the May 1977 issue of Hoard's Dairyman magazine, which had contained a brief and somewhat skeptical feature about Mediterranean water buffalo dairy imports to the eastern United States. She had read the USDA Technical Bulletin on water buffalo production in tropical and subtropical climates. She had ordered through the Lancaster County Library's interlibrary loan system a 1968 FAO monograph on the Italian Mediterranean breed and its adaptation to temperate northern climates. She had written 3 letters to university dairy science departments asking for published research on water buffalo milk composition and mozzarella production yield ratios. 2 of the 3 departments had written back. She had been building a case. She had been building it for months, quietly at the kitchen table in the evenings after the milking was done and Daniel had gone to bed and the house was still. She had been building it without telling anyone because she understood that in Lancaster County in 1977 there was no one she could tell who would not tell her she was wrong, and she already knew everything they would say, and none of it was going to change what she was going to do. She had been 46 years old that winter. She had been widowed for 3 years. She had been running the home place on 40 acres and a part-time hired man and her own labor and whatever help Daniel could give between his classes at Penn State, and she had been doing it well enough that the bank had not called and the barn had not fallen and the Holstein herd had held its numbers. She had been doing it the way she did everything, without announcing it, without explaining it, without asking anyone's opinion. She had made her decision by February of 1977. She had begun preparing in May of 1978. She started in the milking parlor, working alone on Saturday afternoons with the barn doors open to the May light. She had studied the stanchion dimensions for weeks. The Mediterranean water buffalo required 4 additional inches of width on each side of the stanchion and 3 additional inches of vertical clearance at the brow bar to accommodate the long curved sweep of the horns. Eleanor measured twice with a steel tape and marked the cuts in pencil on the existing frame. She cut the new stanchion uprights from a 40-foot length of 2x8 white oak Norman had sawn from a wood lot on the property in 1968 and stored dry under the equipment shed with a hand-painted date on the end grain. The oak was perfectly seasoned. It cut clean. She welded the new tie rails herself with the Lincoln SA-200 arc welder Norman had bought in 1965, working in the Saturday afternoon quiet with the smell of hot metal and white oak sawdust mixing in the still spring air. She worked 3 consecutive Saturday afternoons in May. In June, she poured a new concrete feed trough, slightly deeper than the Holstein standard, to accommodate the larger ration the heavier breed required. She ordered 3 larger diameter inflation rubbers from a specialty dairy equipment supply house in Lancaster that handled Amish and Mennonite dairy operations and that did not ask unnecessary questions about what breed of animal the equipment was for. In July, she cleaned out the basement room beneath the kitchen and poured a 4-inch concrete floor with a center drain, leveling it herself with a hand screed. She bought 2 used stainless steel cheese vats from an estate sale outside Philadelphia and had them delivered to the farm on a flatbed truck. She moved them to the basement on a hand dolly, alone on a Saturday evening, the vat's weight requiring 4 separate rest stops on the basement stairs and leaving 2 shallow gouges in the plaster wall of the stairwell that she never repaired. She did not tell Daniel what she was preparing. Daniel was at Penn State through the spring of 1978 and came home for summers. He saw the new stanchions. He saw the basement floor. He said nothing. He was 21, and he was watching his mother with the particular quiet attention of a young man who has grown up beside a parent who does not explain herself until the explanation becomes necessary. She did not tell the bank. She did not tell the cooperative extension office. She did not tell the milk hauler. She did not tell any of the men at the Birchfield diner who would have had opinions. She did not tell the minister's wife at the First Lutheran Church, who would also have had opinions and who would have mentioned it at the next potluck. She drove to Bristol, Vermont in early August of 1978 in the cab of a borrowed 2-trailer livestock rig she had arranged through a Wayne County trucker she had done business with for years. The Vermont breeder's name was Harlan Voss. He was a quiet, lean man in his mid-50s with a careful handshake and the particular unhurried competence of a man who has worked with unusual animals long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything they do. He had imported the first Mediterranean water buffalo calves into New England in 1973, one of 3 Americans to bring the breed into the country that decade. He had built his herd to 28 head by 1977. The specialty mozzarella market he had been promised by a small Italian-American restaurant cooperative in Boston had collapsed in 1976 when the cooperative's anchor restaurant on Hanover Street had closed during the post-recession downturn. Harlan had spent 2 years trying to place surplus animals with any operation willing to take them. In 31 outreach letters to American dairy operations, he had received no commercial offers. Eleanor's letter in June of 1978 had been his first serious inquiry in 18 months. He met her at the barn at 7 in the morning. He showed her the herd without salesmanship, walking the fence line slowly and answering questions in full. Eleanor had questions. She had been preparing them for months. She asked about milking temperament, about the adaptation to temperate cold, about the morning-evening production differential, about the seasonal butterfat variation. Harlan answered each question from experience, not from literature. She listened without writing anything down. She looked at each animal for a long time before she moved to the next. She selected 6 3-bred heifers, 2 dry cows, and the young bull with the widest horn sweep in the herd. She paid Harlan Voss $4,800 in cash on the morning of September 2, 1978, from an envelope she had been building since January, from the monthly cheese and butter money she had set aside out of the Holstein Operations household account. She had told the bank the envelope account was a maintenance reserve. It was not a maintenance reserve. It was a water buffalo fund. She drove the 6 animals 460 miles home in 2 trips in the borrowed livestock rig, the first trip with 3 animals, and the second with the remaining 3, each leg of the drive completed overnight to keep the animals cooler and to arrive in the early morning before the county was fully awake. She told Daniel she was going to Vermont to look at some equipment. She had read her grandmother Vera's recipe book 74 times by the morning she pulled the trailer back into the gravel yard. The town of Birchfield heard about the water buffalo by the second week of October 1978. The Birchfield Diner sat on Main Street between the Lancaster County Courthouse and the Farmers and Savings Bank, and on Tuesday and Friday mornings, the long Formica counter filled up before 6, with men in faded olive green and navy work caps drinking coffee from chipped enamel mugs and arguing about the federal milk price at the Philadelphia Federal Milk Marketing Order and the fall corn silage harvest and the question of whether the new federal dairy termination program would force herd buyouts across the county. They were Lancaster County Holstein dairymen, most of them 2nd and 3rd and 4th generation, and they had been reading the same Penn State Extension bulletins and attending the same dairy producers meetings and arguing about the same Class 1 milk price for going on 20 years. They knew each other's operations the way you know something you have watched every day for most of your life, not perfectly, and with plenty of room for misunderstanding, but with the particular intimacy of people who work the same ground in the same climate in the same season. The story of the Whitfield widow's water buffalo became the dominant topic of conversation at the Birchfield Diner by the second week of October 1978. The man who put it there was Gordon Parrish. Gordon Parrish was the Lancaster County Cooperative Extension Agent. He was 59 years old in the autumn of 1978, stocky and barrel-chested, his face reddened and weathered from 3 decades of supervisory work in open dairy parlors and windy cover crop demonstration plots. His brown and gray stubble was his permanent condition. He wore a faded olive-green ball cap with a stained brim, a faded denim jacket over a blue plaid pearl snap shirt, dark Wrangler jeans, soft from years of washing, and scuffed rubber muck boots. His mouth had the set of a man who has spent his whole life believing he is responsible for other people's decisions and has developed from that belief a particular kind of preemptive worry that could look from a distance like concern. He had served in the Lancaster County Extension Office for 21 years. His brother-in-law, a man named Victor Strand, ran the largest commercial Holstein operation in the county, 600 acres, 212, had a new parallel line milking parlor installed in 1972, a relationship with the regional milk cooperative that went back to the mid-1950s. Gordon had not been an extension agent for 21 years without understanding the relationship between institutional advice and institutional interest. He understood it. He did not discuss it. He believed, to the extent that a man can separate belief from interest, that the Holstein recommendations he had been making for 2 decades were professionally sound. He had the Penn State bulletins to prove it. He had wanted the Whitfield 40 acres before Norman died. He had continued to want it after. He had come by on Sunday afternoons in 1975 and 1976, bringing casseroles his wife Ruth made, asking in the tone of a practical and concerned neighbor whether Eleanor had given any thought to leasing the back 20 to Victor's operation for a couple of seasons while she found her footing. Eleanor had thanked him. She had not leased the back 20. She had mowed her own ditches and farmed the operation herself and not asked for anyone's help or opinion. The water buffalo changed the nature of the conversation at the diner. Gordon had heard about the animals on a Monday morning from his hired man, who had heard it from the grain elevator operator on Friday. Gordon had not believed it. He had driven past the Whitfield pasture on the Tuesday afternoon and had counted by the rough estimate of a man who has run dairy cattle for 37 years, 6 unmistakably non-Holstein animals grazing among the Whitfield dairy herd in the upper pasture. He had slowed the truck. He had looked for a full minute. Then he had driven home. He had told his wife Ruth over supper. Ruth had set down the serving spoon and looked at him and said, "Gordon, you will not go over there and make a scene." He had told the story at the diner counter the next 3 mornings. He had told it at the Lancaster County Dairy Producers Association meeting in mid-October. He had told it at the First Lutheran Coffee Hour on the 3rd Sunday of October, standing at the basement fellowship hall table with his coffee cup, with the patient, slightly concerned expression of a man delivering a professional assessment he wishes were otherwise. He said it at the diner counter on a Thursday morning with 4 other men listening. He said water buffalo in 1978 are a circus animal. They are not a dairy animal. The Whitfield widow has decided to honor her late husband, Norman, by purchasing something that nobody in this county can milk, market, or process. Nobody should mistake the gesture for a business decision. It was not a controversial position. It was in the professional consensus of the Lancaster County Cooperative Extension System of the Penn State University Dairy Science Department, of every milk-hauling cooperative between Birchfield and Philadelphia, of every cheese plant in the county, of every farming operation that had attended the last 10 Dairy Producers Association meetings, the obvious and correct professional assessment. Water buffalo had no commercial future in American dairying. The Italian Mediterranean water buffalo was in the language of the 1977 Penn State Specialty Livestock Bulletin that Gordon had read and annotated and filed in the 3rd drawer of his office desk, a heritage breed with historical cultural significance in South Asian and Mediterranean agricultural contexts that had demonstrated no viable pathway to commercial integration in the modern American milk market. Eleanor Whitfield was going to be sitting on water buffalo milk she could not ship, and water buffalo cheese she could not move, and by the spring of 1980 she was going to be selling the animals at salvage price to a petting zoo or a hobby farm, and coming to someone Gordon understood, the someone would probably be him, to ask about leasing the back 20. This was not cruelty. In 1978 it was the professional consensus. And professional consensus is not the same thing as cruelty, even when it is wrong. Ruth Parrish heard the diner counter version of the story on a Thursday morning from her sister-in-law, who had heard it from Victor's wife at the grocery store. Ruth set down a coffee pot at the kitchen table that evening and looked at her husband across the oilcloth and said what she said without raising her voice. "Gordon, you do not call her that widow again. She is Norman's wife. She buried him 4 years ago. She is 47 years old, and she has been running that 40-acre place alone with a part-time hired man and a son who is away at college, and her mother is in the nursing home in Worcester. You will go over there tomorrow morning, and you will ask her what she has done, and you will listen to the answer, all of it, before you say anything." Gordon drove over the next morning. Eleanor was standing at the south gate of the upper pasture with her small leather tally book in her left hand and a pencil stub in her right when she heard his truck turn in from the county road. She did not turn around. She finished the entry she was writing in the tally book. She closed the book. She walked across the wet ryegrass to the gate at a pace that said she was not hurrying for anyone, and had not been hurrying for anyone for a long time. Gordon had parked at the lane and walked to the gate. He was standing at the fence line with his cap in his hand when she reached him. He said, "Eleanor." She said, "Gordon." He looked across the pasture at the 6 water buffalo grazing at the far end of the upper field, alongside 3 Holsteins that had wandered up from the lower section. He put his cap back on. He took it off again. He said, "I drove past Tuesday. I counted 6 animals that are not Holstein cows. I drove home, and I asked Ruth to tell me I was seeing things. Ruth told me to come over here and ask you. Eleanor, what in God's name have you done?" Eleanor crossed her arms. She looked at him with the direct, unhurried gaze of a woman who has been expecting this conversation and has had months to prepare for it. She said, "I bought 6 Italian Mediterranean water buffalo from a Vermont breeder named Harlan Voss, 3 bred heifers, 2 dry cows, and a young bull. I paid $4,800 in cash on the morning of September 2nd. I drove them 460 miles home in 2 trips in a borrowed livestock rig. I am running them on the back 20 alongside the Holstein herd. I will milk the 3 bred heifers in the spring of 1979 when they freshen. I will make Italian mozzarella di bufala in my grandmother's recipe, the family method that my grandmother Vera Bonetti brought from a village outside Milan in 1898, and that I have been studying for the past 2 years. I will direct market the cheese to specialty buyers in the Italian-American restaurant and delicatessen trade. I am not asking the regional milk cooperative to haul water buffalo milk. I am not selling into the Philadelphia fluid milk market. This is a parallel direct marketing operation on the same 40 acres, running alongside the Holstein dairy." Gordon looked at her. He looked at the herd. He put his cap on and adjusted the brim. He said, "Eleanor, you cannot run a commercial water buffalo dairy in Lancaster County in 1978. The Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture does not have an inspection protocol for water buffalo milk. The Philadelphia Federal Milk Marketing Order does not have a class designation for water buffalo milk. The regional hauler does not have equipment for water buffalo milk. There is no Italian immigrant specialty market in central Pennsylvania large enough to absorb commercial mozzarella production. The nearest serious market for that kind of cheese is the New York City restaurant trade. That is 470 miles east of this gate. You are going to be sitting on water buffalo milk you cannot legally process, and water buffalo cheese you cannot commercially move, and by the spring of 1980 you are going to be selling those animals to a zoo or a hobby operation at salvage prices. And when that happens, I want you to know that I am not going to say I told you so, but I am going to be here when you need to talk about what comes next." Eleanor did not look away. She said, "My grandmother Vera Bonetti told me in the summer of 1937 that the day would come when the American market would be ready for real mozzarella. The Italian-American restaurant community in the New York metropolitan area is growing, and it is reaching a point of critical mass around authentic Italian cooking. The specialty cheese shops in Brooklyn and on Long Island are looking for domestic buffalo milk supply because the fresh imported fior di latte from Italy will not survive the transatlantic shipping window at a price the restaurant trade can sustain. By 1986, there is going to be a working specialty market in this country for American water buffalo mozzarella, and I am going to be the only producer east of the Rocky Mountains who is positioned to supply it because I have been building toward it since the winter of 1977, and nobody else in this county has been paying attention to what is happening in Brooklyn." She paused. "I am not asking you to understand this. I am not asking for your professional assessment. I am telling you what I am doing so that you do not have to come to this gate and ask me again." Gordon Parrish stood at the fence line and held his cap against his chest with both hands and looked at Eleanor Whitfield for a long moment. Then he looked at the 6 water buffalo grazing peacefully in the upper pasture in the October morning light. their slate-gray backs moving slowly among the black and white Holsteins, unbothered and unhurried, and completely at ease in a field that had never held anything like them. He said, "Eleanor, I cannot stop you. I am going home. I will watch what happens." He drove home. Eleanor watched his truck until it disappeared around the bend of the county road. Then she opened the gate and walked out into the upper pasture toward the herd. The young bull had moved to the center of the field and was standing in the late morning light with his head up, his horns sweep wide against the October sky. Eleanor walked past him without looking at him. She walked to the far end of the pasture and stood at the upper fence line and looked out across the rolling Lancaster County landscape, the neighboring dairy operations, the hedgerows, the church steeple visible above the tree line, 2 miles east, the whole familiar geography of a county that had been telling her in one form or another for 30 years what she ought to do. She took out her tally book. She wrote the date. She wrote 6 animals, home, beginning. She put the book in her coat pocket. She walked back down the slope to the barn. The minister's wife pulled Eleanor aside in the basement fellowship hall of the First Lutheran Church at the 3rd Sunday potluck dinner of October in a quiet corner near the coat rack, while the casseroles were still being set out on the long folding tables, and the room was full of the particular compressed noise of a church basement on a Sunday afternoon in October. The minister's wife was a careful gentlewoman named Helen, who meant nothing but kindness, and who communicated through her very particular brand of worried gentleness a great deal about what the congregation was thinking. Helen said, her voice low, her hand briefly touching Eleanor's arm. "Eleanor, I wanted to ask you the animals you brought in the water buffalo. I just wondered if that was something Norman would have." Eleanor looked at her across a corner of the folding table that held a broccoli casserole and a pan of apple still cake. She said, "Norman told me in 1972 that whatever I wanted to do with the operation after he was gone was my business." He said it once. He did not say it again. That is how Norman communicated when he meant something permanently. Helen nodded carefully. Eleanor carried her own broccoli casserole back to the kitchen table and washed her own dish before she left. The manager of the Farmers and Savings Bank on Main Street in Birchfield was a man named Howard Draper, who had managed the branch since 1969, and who had processed the Whitfield operating note renewals for the past 4 years without difficulty, and who pulled Eleanor aside in the lobby on a Saturday morning in November, after she had completed a routine deposit at the teller window, to ask her in, a voice kept low and respectful, whether she had fully thought through what the Class 1 milk hauler in Birchfield was going to do when she tried to incorporate water buffalo milk into the Holstein production stream. Eleanor told him in the same quiet tone that she was not going to incorporate the water buffalo milk into the Holstein production stream. She was going to process it separately in a dedicated basement operation and market the resulting cheese directly to specialty buyers in the Italian-American trade, bypassing the regional milk cooperative entirely. Howard Draper looked at her for a moment. He nodded. He said he hoped it would work out. He walked back to his office. Eleanor walked out of the bank into the November air and drove home. The county was watching. The county would always be watching. That was fine. She had known the county would be watching since the morning she pulled the livestock trailer into the gravel yard at 5:30 in the September dark. She had known it, and she had prepared for it, and she had made her peace with it, the same way her grandmother Vera had made her peace with arriving in a county that had never heard of mozzarella de bufala, and had no intention of learning, and had simply set up the wooden molds on the kitchen counter and started making the cheese anyway, first for the small Lombard community, then for whoever in the broader Lancaster County Italian-American trade came to find it. The difference between Eleanor and Vera was that Eleanor had the animals. She had brought them home. Now she had to make the cheese. The first mozzarella was made on a Thursday morning in April of 1979. Eleanor had been waiting for it since September. She had spent the autumn and winter months learning the herd, their individual temperaments, their feed preferences, their milking behavior. The 3 bred heifers were named in her tally book by number B1, B2, and B3. The two dry cows were D1 and D2. The young bull she had not named. She referred to him in the tally book as the bull which was accurate and sufficient. The bull had a personality that was, she told Daniel once, somewhere between confident and philosophical. He did whatever he decided to do, and he did it at his own pace, and he was neither aggressive nor indifferent, but somewhere in between, watchful, present, deliberate. He reminded her somewhat of Norman. She did not tell Daniel that. The three bred heifers freshened in March and early April of 1979, one by one in the back stall of the milking parlor, and Eleanor stood with each of them through the night of each freshening the way she had stood with the Holstein cows through their freshenings for the past 24 years. The births went cleanly. The calves were strong. The milk came in pale cream-colored thick with butterfat 8 to 9% against a Holstein's 4. It was the color of old ivory. It was dense and warm and slightly sweet in a way that cow's milk was not, and it left a different residue on the inside of the milking pail, richer, more adhesive, with a faint sweetness in the smell. Eleanor hand-milked the three fresh heifers twice a day in the modified stanchion stalls she had built the previous spring, using the larger diameter inflation cluster Daniel had welded onto a spare surge milker frame in the winter. The water buffalo produced approximately 12 quarts per cow per day against the Holstein average of 48. The volume was low. The cream content was extraordinary. She collected the milk in the stainless vat in the basement kitchen. She heated it slowly and carefully on the two-burner propane setup she had installed against the south wall, using the thermometer she had ordered from the Lancaster specialty equipment supplier in January. She added the starter culture. The starter culture was from the clay jar her great-great-grandmother Lucia Bonetti had sealed in 1898 before Vera left for America. Eleanor's mother, Adelheid, had maintained it, refreshing it every 6 months by pulling a small inoculation from the active culture and introducing it to fresh milk and allowing it to re-establish before resealing without a single lapse in the 90-year uninterrupted succession. Eleanor had taken over the maintenance from Adelheid in 1971 when Adelheid moved to the nursing home. She had refreshed it 12 times since then. The culture had been alive and working and being passed forward since before anyone currently living had been born. She added the culture to the warmed milk. She added the rennet. She watched the curd begin to form. Daniel stood in the doorway of the basement kitchen in his work coat and watched. He had been watching for months without speaking much about any of it. He had helped where Eleanor asked him to help. He had welded the inflation cluster. He had helped pour the basement floor. He had helped move the cheese vats down the stairwell. He had not asked her again what she was doing or why, in part because he had learned from 22 years of being her son that Eleanor did not explain herself in advance of the results, and in part because he sensed watching her work that he was seeing something he would need to understand slowly, in the same way the light changes in a field, not all at once but incrementally, the new condition arriving so gradually that you cannot point to the exact moment when it became the thing it now is. The curd came firm by mid-morning. Eleanor cut it with the hand-cranked curd cutter Daniel had built from a salvaged tractor flywheel, a device that was ungainly and loud and worked perfectly. She heated the whey in the second vat. She pulled the curd mass into the heated whey and began the stretch. Her grandmother's recipe book described the stretch in careful, patient Italian, annotated in the margins by 2 additional hands, her great-grandmother's, and then her grandmother's, adding observations about timing and temperature and the particular feel of the curd when it had been worked long enough. Eleanor had read the annotations so many times she no longer needed the book open in front of her. She knew the text the way she knew the morning milking route by the body, not the mind. She worked the curd with her hands in the heated whey, pulling and folding her arms, working in the slow, rhythmic motion the recipe described. The curd resisted at first and then yielded and then began to move with her, becoming smooth, becoming elastic, becoming something that caught the light from the single basement window and held it in a way that was different from anything she had worked before. It was the color of fresh snow in low morning sun. It was warm against her hands. It smelled very faintly of warm milk and sweet grass and something older that had no name she knew. She shaped the first ball in her grandmother's wooden mold. The mold was made of Italian alder. Her great-great-grandfather, Tommaso Bonetti, had cut it from a single block in the autumn of 1879, 99 years before Eleanor's hands closed around it, for the first time in a Lancaster County basement kitchen. It was worn smooth from a century of handling. Its interior surface had taken on a faint amber color from decades of contact with fresh mozzarella. The grain of the Italian alder was still visible through the amber surface, fine and even the way old wood looks when it has been used by careful hands for a very long time. The mold fit Eleanor's hands in a way that no piece of equipment she had ever purchased had fit her hands, not because it had been made for her, but because it had been made by someone whose hands were across 5 generations and an Atlantic Ocean not so different from hers. She made 3 balls. She lifted them one by one from the warm way and lowered them into a shallow pan of cool salted water. She and Daniel ate the first one that evening at the kitchen table, sliced thin with a little coarse salt and nothing else. Daniel cut his piece with the small kitchen knife and tasted it. He set the knife down. He sat quietly for a moment, his hands flat on the table. He looked at his plate. He looked up at his mother. His eyes were full. He was not a young man who cried easily. He had buried his father at 18 without making a sound at the graveside. Eleanor looked at him across the formica table in the April kitchen light and waited. The house was quiet. The barn light was on through the window. The April evening was coming in slow and cold from the north. After a moment, Daniel said, "I've never tasted anything like this." Eleanor said, "Neither have I." She cut a second piece of the mozzarella. She ate it. It was exactly what her grandmother had described in the recipe book, annotations exact in a way she had not quite believed was possible from a written description. The way a piece of music you have only read on the page is never quite what you imagined until the first time you hear it played. They ate the rest of the first ball in silence. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He did it once without comment, and then he picked up his fork again. Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing to say that the cheese had not already said better. The second and third balls went to Cleveland. Eleanor drove the 86 miles in a borrowed 1973 Chevrolet station wagon on a gray April morning, with the cheese packed in waxed paper and nested in a brown paper grocery bag on the passenger seat. She had a name from a Lancaster County Italian-American grocer named Silvio Ricci, who had been selling her olive oil since 1975, and who had, when she had asked him carefully in February whether he knew anyone in the Cleveland Italian trade who took fresh mozzarella seriously, given her the name and address of a Sicilian restaurateur in the Cleveland Hill neighborhood named Sal Moretti, who had owned a basement restaurant on Euclid Avenue since 1955, and who was, in Silvio's assessment, the most serious Italian cook in northeastern Ohio, and the man least likely in that state to accept a fake version of anything Italian. Eleanor parked on Euclid Avenue at 11 in the morning. She carried the paper bag into the restaurant and asked the woman at the bar to speak with the chef. Sal Moretti came out of the kitchen 4 minutes later. He was 61 years old, and he had the unhurried, slightly impatient authority of a man who has cooked serious food for 30 years and has stopped being interested in most of what people bring through his kitchen door. He came out wiping his hands on his apron and looked at Eleanor and looked at the paper bag and looked at Eleanor again with the particular professional skepticism of someone who has been handed things in paper bags before and has almost never been surprised in a good way. He took the bag back to the kitchen without saying anything. Eleanor waited at the bar. The restaurant was not yet open for lunch. A radio in the kitchen was playing something Italian at low volume. The bar smelled of old wood and espresso, and something Eleanor could not name that might have been garlic, or might have been decades of good cooking absorbed into the walls. 4 minutes later, Sal Moretti returned. He set the bag on the bar. He looked at Eleanor. He said, "Where did you buy this?" Eleanor said, "I made it." "From what recipe?" "My grandmother's." "What cow?" Eleanor said, "It is not a cow, it is a water buffalo." Sal Moretti looked at her. He did not speak for a moment. He walked back to the kitchen. He returned 30 seconds later carrying a small white plate with a second thin slice on it. He tasted the second slice standing at the bar with the plate in his hand. He set the plate down. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that had in it no skepticism at all anymore, and something else instead, something that in a younger man might have been surprise, but in a man of 61 was more like recognition, the look of someone who has not seen a face in a very long time and has just seen it again around an unexpected corner. He reached into his apron pocket. He counted bills onto the bar. $7 a pound for the entire bag in cash without negotiating. He said, "You will bring me more next Friday." Eleanor said she would try. She drove the 86 miles back to Birchfield with the empty grocery bag folded on the passenger seat and the money in her coat pocket, and the radio on at low volume, playing the afternoon farm report out of the Lancaster station, the announcer reading the Class 1 milk prices at the Philadelphia Federal Milk Marketing Order in a flat professional voice that listed numbers Eleanor was no longer certain she cared as much about as she had cared about them the previous year. She pulled into the gravel yard at dusk. Daniel was closing up the Holstein barn. He saw her face when she got out of the car. He waited. She held up the folded bills from her coat pocket. He nodded slowly, once the way his father had nodded when something he had expected came to pass. They walked into the house together. Eleanor made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. She put the money on the table between them, and they looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then Daniel said, "How much per pound?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic. He said, "That is more than twice what we get for Holstein milk equivalent." Eleanor said, "Yes." He said, "When do you go back?" She said, "Friday." He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. They sat at the kitchen table in the April evening with the barn light on through the window and the money on the table between them, and neither of them said anything more about it for the rest of the evening, because there was nothing more to say. The cheese had been made. The cheese had been sold. The thing her grandmother had described on a farmhouse porch in Lancaster County in the summer of 1937 was in the early stages of becoming real. The word got out by the summer of 1979. Not in Lancaster County in the Italian-American specialty food trade in northeastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania, which operated by its own particular network of referrals and recommendations, and word passed across delicatessen counters and at the back tables of restaurant kitchens where suppliers and chefs had been talking to each other in a combination of English and Italian for 40 years. Sal Moretti had told his produce supplier. His produce supplier had told a Pittsburgh deli owner named Marco Ferri. Marco Ferri had called Eleanor directly. The third batch went to a Pittsburgh delicatessen. The fourth batch went to a Columbus specialty grocer. The fifth batch went to a Cleveland Italian grocery on Murray Hill that had been selling good cheese since 1952, and whose owner had cried at the first taste the way Daniel had cried, though he did not mention it in the order form. By the end of 1979, Eleanor was making 26 pounds of mozzarella per week from 12 milking water buffalo and selling through a small and growing network of Cleveland and Pittsburgh Italian-American specialty buyers at prices ranging from $6 to $9 a pound, depending on the buyer and the volume. The total cheese revenue for 1979 was approximately $7,000. The Holstein herd in the same year produced roughly 400,000 pounds of fluid milk and grossed $62,000. The water buffalo generated 11% of the operation's total revenue in 1979. 11% was not enough to live on. 11% was enough to know the direction. Gordon Parrish was not taking it seriously. He attributed the cheese revenue to hobby income. the kind of side revenue that a few Lancaster County farm wives generated from specialty products, baked goods, preserves, handmade items sold at the farmer's market in Birchfield on Saturday mornings. Respectable, small, not a business. He was still watching. He was a patient man. He had seen commodity dairy cycles come and go for 30 years, and he knew that the Holstein milk price would drop again in the early 1980s, the way it always did, and that when it did, the 40 acres without a strong commodity income base would become difficult to sustain, and that when they became difficult to sustain, he would be in a position to have the conversation he had been waiting to have. He did not have long to wait for the milk price decline. He had longer to wait than he expected for everything else. By 1981, the water buffalo share of the Whitfield operation's total revenue had climbed to 24%. The customer list had grown to 31 buyers in 4 cities. Eleanor had not raised her price since 1979 because she did not want to lose the network she had spent 2 years building. She would raise prices later when the network was secure. For now, she kept the quality absolutely constant and the delivery absolutely reliable and the packaging absolutely consistent. Waxed paper twine, wooden apple crates, Friday morning, shipments by UPS overnight, freight, and let the cheese speak for itself. The cheese spoke clearly. By 1983, the herd had grown to 40 milking animals through natural breeding from the original 6. The young bull Eleanor still called him the bull in the tally book 4 years in, had done his work with the confidence and consistency she had observed in him from the first morning on the ramp. The weekly production had reached 78 pounds. The regional specialty rate had climbed to $11 a pound. Gross cheese revenue in 1983 was $45,000 against the Holstein operation's $71,000. The customer list by the end of 1983 was 46 buyers across Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Cincinnati, and Akron. By the end of 1985, it was 112. Every customer had come from word of mouth. Eleanor had never paid for advertising of any kind. She had never sent a catalog or attended a trade show or hired a sales representative. She had never approached a buyer. Every approach had come the other way. One buyer telling another the chain of recommendation running from Sal Moretti's kitchen on Euclid Avenue outward in every direction into the Italian-American specialty food trade of northeastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania, moving along the same networks that had connected Italian immigrant communities in American industrial cities for the previous 60 years, networks that were, it turned out, extremely efficient at distributing information about the existence of excellent fresh buffalo mozzarella being made by a German-Italian widow on a 40-acre farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. She had simply made the cheese her grandmother had taught her mother to make, packed it in the wooden crates with the waxed paper and the twine, shipped it east on Friday mornings. Daniel had gone to the bank. The summer of 1982 had been the hardest year the operation faced in the first decade. A flood in early July, 3 inches of rain in 6 hours on saturated ground, had taken out the lower pasture fence along the creek bed and contaminated the east field drainage for 6 weeks, requiring Eleanor to hold 4 of the younger milking animals off the pasture and supplement their feed from stored hay at a cost she had not budgeted. The Holstein milk price at the Philadelphia Federal Milk Marketing Order had dropped to its lowest point since 1976. The hired man, a quiet older fellow named Fred Harker, who had worked part-time at the home place since 1975, had taken a factory job in Lancaster in June that paid 30% more than Eleanor could match. She spent 11 days in August rebuilding the lower pasture fence line herself, post by post, in the heat alone. Daniel had been watching his mother work from the house and from the barn and from wherever he happened to be on the property, and he had been thinking about his savings account, which he had been drawing on since his return from Penn State in 1977, and about the fact that in 5 years of working the home place alongside his mother, he had not drawn a salary, and about the fact that he was 26 years old and had no income of his own, and no clear horizon on which income from the water buffalo operation would be sufficient to support both of them at a living wage. He was not giving up. He was being honest with himself, which is a different thing, and in a 26-year-old harder. He came to Eleanor on a Tuesday evening in September of 1982 and sat down at the kitchen table and did not look at her for a moment. Then he said, "There is a bookkeeping position open at the Farmers and Savings branch in Lancaster. My college roommate is branch manager now. He told me about it last week. I think I need to take it. I am not telling you this is wrong. I am not asking you to stop. I am saying I cannot keep going the way we are going without a salary, and I don't know when that changes." Eleanor was quiet. She looked at the window over the kitchen sink. The pasture was visible in the fading September light. The water buffalo were moving slowly across the upper field, the bull at the far end near the fence line, the herd spread wide in the late afternoon grass. She said, "Then go." Daniel said, "That's all you're going to say." Eleanor said, "What else should I say?" "You have told me what you need. I have told you what I think. You should go if you need to go." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I'll come on weekends." She nodded. He started at the bank in October. He came on Saturday mornings through the autumn and winter of 1982 and into 1983 for the Holstein milking, for the heavier cheese vat work, for the Friday morning packing and shipping. He drove back to his apartment in Lancaster on Sunday afternoons. He called on Wednesday evenings. Eleanor gave him the weekly numbers on the phone: herd count, production volume, cheese weight, revenue, in the same flat, factual tone she used for everything. Eleanor ran the water buffalo milking entirely alone. 5 in the morning, 7 days a week, every day, regardless of weather or condition, and again at 6 in the evening. She had started the water buffalo milking in the spring of 1979 by herself, and she ran it by herself through every hard season of the early 1980s, through the flood summer and the lost hired man and the falling milk price, and the bank's periodic, carefully worded letters about the operating note, and she never delegated the task because the water buffalo milking was the center of the operation in a way that was not only practical, but something else, a daily confirmation that the thing she was building was real, that it continued, that it had not been broken by whatever the previous week or month had brought. The amber eyes in the morning dark, the warm, thick milk, the wooden molds, the culture from the clay jar, the recipe in her grandmother's handwriting. These were the things that held. Gordon Parrish was still watching and still patient. He expected the operation to follow the predictable arc, the hobby income peaking out, the Holstein revenue declining, in the commodity trough the banknote coming due, without sufficient collateral. He knew the dairy cycle. He had watched it 3 times in 20 years. What he did not know, what no one in Lancaster County knew, except Eleanor and a small research team at Penn State, was that the Whitfield operation had been, since the spring of 1984, the subject of academic documentation. The dark blue Plymouth Volare had arrived at the Whitfield gate on a Tuesday morning in May of 1984. A woman got out of the driver's side. She was in her early 40s, wore a Penn State extension jacket, and carried a clipboard, and had the efficient, slightly distracted air of an academic researcher in the field who is thinking about 3 things simultaneously. 2 graduate students climbed out of the back seat carrying sample collection kits. She introduced herself at the gate as Dr. Carol Faber, Dairy Science, Penn State Agricultural Research and Development Center in Worce. She said she had read a brief, unsigned feature in the regional dairy press the previous autumn describing an undisclosed Lancaster County dairy producing authentic Italian mozzarella di bufala from a working water buffalo herd, and that she had spent 4 months identifying the operation, and that she would very much like, with Eleanor's permission, to spend 4 days on the property, documenting the herd, the milking system, and the cheese-making protocol. Eleanor opened the gate. She said, "You may have 4 days. I have one condition. My name does not appear in any publication. If you reference this operation in print, you will call it a cooperating producer, and you will not identify its location beyond the county." Dr. Faber said, "Agreed." She spent 4 consecutive days at the home place. She measured the herd and sampled the milk composition at every stage of the production cycle. She documented the cheese-making protocol step by step, from the heating of the raw milk through the stretching and molding and the cooling bath. She examined the wooden molds and held them carefully and looked at them for a long time. She took cultures from the clay starter jars using sterile collection tubes and labeled the samples in pencil. She photographed the aging room. She asked Eleanor on the last afternoon, sitting across from each other in the basement kitchen over coffee while the graduate students packed equipment upstairs, how long the starter cultures had been maintained in continuous use without a cross to any commercial culture strain. Eleanor said, "My grandmother sealed the jars in 1898 before she left for America. My mother maintained the refresh cycle every 6 months from 1920 until 1971 when she moved to the nursing home. I have maintained it since 1971. As far as we have been able to document, no commercial culture has been introduced at any point in that succession." Dr. Faber did not speak for a moment. Then she wrote something in her field notebook, underlined it twice, and closed the notebook. She published her first paper in the Journal of Dairy Science in the spring of 1985. The cooperating dairy was identified as Cooperator J, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The paper documented the first confirmed American water buffalo dairy operation with a fully traceable, uninterrupted starter culture lineage dating to 1898, and established baseline milk composition data for the Mediterranean water buffalo breed under Pennsylvania temperate climate conditions. A second paper followed in 1986 in the same journal, establishing production yield ratios for mozzarella de bufala production from the Cooperator J milk supply. A third paper appeared in Food Technology in 1987, focusing on the sensory profile and compositional characteristics of the Cooperator J mozzarella output compared to imported Italian product. None of the 3 papers identified Eleanor Whitfield or the Whitfield home place by name. No one in Lancaster County identified Cooperator J. Eleanor knew. She kept the secret for 4 years, as she had agreed to do. The years between 1982 and 1985 were the years of slow, patient, invisible growth, invisible to Gordon Parrish, invisible to the men at the Birchfield Diner, invisible to the bank manager, invisible to the cooperative extension system that had written off the operation as a hobby in 1978 and had seen no reason to revise that assessment. The water buffalo herd grew. The weekly production climbed. The customer list lengthened. The revenue share shifted quarter by quarter away from the Holstein commodity operation and toward the direct marketing cheese business that nobody in the official agricultural infrastructure of Lancaster County had thought could work. By December of 1985, the water buffalo cheese operation had grown to 46 milking animals. Weekly production exceeded 84 pounds. The regional specialty rate had climbed to $14 a pound. The annual cheese revenue was approaching $60,000. The Holstein operation's annual revenue was declining following the commodity milk price down and was now approximately $63,000, still ahead of the cheese but barely, and losing ground every quarter. Eleanor had not raised prices in 2 years. She was about to stop needing to worry about price pressure from the Northeast Ohio Italian-American specialty market because something much larger was approaching from the east. In November of 1985, a dark gray Lincoln Town Car pulled into Harlan Voss's driveway in Bristol, Vermont. The man who got out was in his mid-50s, dressed in a wool topcoat over a pressed white shirt, carrying a leather briefcase. His name was John Hartley. He had been born in Brooklyn in 1931 to a family from the Campania region of southern Italy. His parents had arrived in New York in 1928, his father working first in the Brooklyn Navy Yard and then in the Italian import food trade on Atlantic Avenue. John had grown up in Carroll Gardens and had been in the Italian specialty cheese business since 1955, starting as a delivery runner for an import shop in Red Hook and working his way up to buyer and eventually to sourcing director. He was currently employed by a small but well-regarded Buffalo mozzarella shop on Court Street in the Carroll Gardens neighborhood of Brooklyn, called Casa de Bufala. The shop had been airshipping fresh fior di latte from a single producer in the Caserta province of Campania since 1971. The arrangement had worked for the first several years. It had been working less and less well since 1979. The spoilage rate on the air shipments had been climbing. Better refrigerated air freight handling had not solved the problem of a cheese that had a shelf life of 48 hours from production being shipped across an ocean from a producer who was 12 time zones away. By 1985, the shop was losing approximately 23% of every air shipment to spoilage before it reached the retail counter. In October of 1985, the owner of Casa de Bufala had told John Hartley, "Plainly find an American producer who can make this cheese the right way, or we close the shop. I am not shipping another winter with these spoilage numbers." John Hartley had spent 6 months searching the eastern United States for working Mediterranean water buffalo dairy operations. He had contacted every agricultural extension office from Maine to Georgia. He had written to every university dairy science department that had published anything about the breed. He had called every specialty livestock broker he knew. He had found 2 operations, a small hobby herd in Maryland that was not milking commercially, and Harlan Voss in Vermont. Harlan's herd was excellent. The milk was excellent. The herd was not large enough to supply the weekly volume Casa de Bufala needed without destroying Harlan's own operation in the process. Over a long conversation at the farmhouse table in Bristol, Harlan had told John Hartley about Eleanor. He had described her as a German-Italian heritage widow in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, who had bought 6 animals from him in September of 1978, and who had, as far as he knew, from a single letter she had sent him in 1983, grown the herd to somewhere north of 40 head, and was producing and selling mozzarella commercially through a network of Italian-American specialty buyers in Ohio and Pennsylvania. He said she was serious. He said she had known what she was doing when she came to his farm in August of 1978, had asked the right questions, had selected the right animals, and had paid in cash without negotiating. That was enough for John Hartley. He wrote Eleanor a letter on the 4th of December 1985. He introduced himself, described Casa de Bufala, explained the supply situation, and asked whether she would be willing to discuss a supply arrangement. Eleanor answered 3 weeks later in a 1-page letter that described the herd size, the current weekly production volume, the production method, and her capacity for expansion. She did not discuss price. She said she would be willing to meet. John Hartley called her on the telephone on January 8, 1986. They spoke for 22 minutes. He arranged a visit for April. He drove 470 miles from Brooklyn in a single 12-hour run on the 11th of April, arriving at a motel outside Lancaster at midnight. He drove the remaining 12 miles to the Whitfield home place on the morning of the 12th and arrived at the gate at 6 in the morning. Eleanor was already in the milking parlor when his headlights came up the lane. She heard the engine of the Lincoln cut. She set down the inflation cluster. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked out to meet him in the gravel yard in the April morning cold, and she looked at the tall, careful man in the wool coat getting out of the dark gray car, and she thought, he has driven through the night to be here at 6 in the morning. He is serious. She said, "Mr. Hartley." He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, thank you for seeing me." She said, "Come inside." She showed him everything. She showed him the milking parlor, the modified stanchion dimensions, the brow bar clearance she had calculated from the FAO technical bulletin in 1978, the larger diameter inflation cluster Daniel had welded onto the surge milker frame. She walked him through the morning milking protocol she had been running, without exception, since the first freshening in March of 1979. She showed him the collection vats and the refrigerated holding room she had built into the north wall of the parlor in 1981. She showed him the basement kitchen, the wooden stretching tables she and Walt Brubaker had built from white oak in 1980, the 2 stainless vats from the Philadelphia estate sale, the hand-cranked curd cutter on its heavy steel frame, the temperature-controlled aging room she had insulated with hand-packed barn straw behind the north wall of the basement in the first year of operation. She showed him the wooden molds. John Hartley took one of the molds in both hands. He turned it over slowly. He looked at the worn amber interior surface, the fine grain of the Italian alder showing through the particular smooth quality of wood that has been handled by careful hands for a very long time. He set it down with care. He looked at Eleanor. He did not say anything. She showed him the clay starter jars. He looked at the beeswax seals and the old Italian cursive on the labels. She told him the jars had been refreshed without cross-contamination for 88 consecutive years. He looked at the jars for a long moment without speaking. She walked him out to the pasture. The 46 milking animals were spread across the upper pasture in the early April morning, grazing in the particular slow, deliberate manner of the Mediterranean breed patient. Self-contained, unhurried, as though they had all the time that had ever existed and were in no danger of running out of it. The young bull from the original 6 was no longer young. He was 10 years old now, and had the settled proprietorial calm of an animal that has been in charge of a herd for a decade and has made his peace with the work. He was standing at the upper fence line when Eleanor and John Hartley came through the gate, and he watched them come with his amber eyes for a moment before he turned and walked slowly across the upper slope toward the salt block at the east fence, as though he had satisfied himself that the situation was under control. John Hartley walked the fence perimeter in his wool coat and good shoes, without complaint about the wet ground or the April cold. He looked at each animal in turn with the focused, systematic attention of a man who has been evaluating livestock and dairy operations for 30 years. He asked 3 technical questions about the seasonal variation in butterfat percentage, about the morning versus evening production differential, and about the annual calving rate and heifer retention protocol. Eleanor answered each question from memory and precisely. He did not write anything down. He was listening in the way that some people listen, with everything. They went back to the house at 11. Eleanor had laid a spread on the kitchen table before the morning milking, a white ceramic plate at the center of the formica table. On the plate, 4 balls of fresh mozzarella di bufala, made the previous day, sliced in half, the cut surfaces smooth and moist, and the color of fresh cream. A small bowl of crushed black pepper. A glass dish of olive oil from the Cleveland Italian grocer she had been ordering from since 1981. A dish of coarse sea salt. A linen towel folded beside the plate. John Hartley sat down. He took off his wool coat and folded it over the back of the chair with the precise care of a man who has spent his life in buildings where coats matter. He looked at the plate for a moment. Then he picked up a piece of the mozzarella between his thumb and forefinger. He held it briefly in the light from the kitchen window, the April light coming in at a low angle across the Lancaster County pasture. He tasted it. He set it down. He was quiet for a moment, his hands flat on the table. He picked up a second piece. He tasted it again more slowly. He set it down. He looked across the formica table at Eleanor. He said in a voice quieter and slower than the voice he had been using for the previous 5 hours, a voice that had in it something he had clearly not expected to feel, because no one ever expects the thing they have been looking for to be exactly the thing they have been looking for, even when they find it. Mrs. Whitfield, this is the cheese my grandmother made in her kitchen in Brooklyn in 1941. I have not tasted it in 45 years. I would like to discuss a supply contract with you. He reached down to the leather satchel on the floor beside his chair. He opened it. He laid a folded document on the formica table between them, centered precisely the way a man places a document he has been carrying for months and knows the weight of. Eleanor looked at the document. She did not touch it. She said, "Tell me what it says." He told her. The contract committed Eleanor to deliver 300 pounds of fresh mozzarella di bufala per week, handmade to specifications documented in an attached production protocol, packed in waxed cheese paper, shipped via overnight refrigerated freight to the Casa de Bufala, receiving dock on Court Street in Brooklyn. The base price was $22 per pound, 5 times the Class 1 Holstein milk equivalent price, and more than double the regional Cleveland and Pittsburgh specialty rate Eleanor had been receiving from her existing network. The term was 5 years. Exclusive supply arrangement for the Casa de Bufala account with a reserved carve-out, allowing Eleanor to continue supplying her existing Cleveland and Pittsburgh specialty network at reduced volumes. Annual revenue at full delivery, $343,000. Eleanor picked up the document. She read it. She read it again. She read it a third time. On the second read, she had taken a pencil from her apron pocket. On the third read, she wrote 2 questions in the left margin of the second page in the same careful, unhurried script she used for the tally book. She set the document down. She asked John Hartley the 2 questions. He answered both clearly, without hesitation, without qualification. She read the relevant sections a final time. She picked up the pencil. She signed the contract at 20 minutes after 11 on the morning of April 12, 1986, at the kitchen table of the Whitfield home place in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on a white formica table that had also held at various times over the previous 12 years Norman Whitfield's last coffee cup, her grandmother's recipe book, her son's tears at the first taste of the cheese, and the operating note from the Farmers and Savings Bank that she had renewed 6 consecutive times. John Hartley signed below her signature. He placed the signed copy in the leather satchel. He stood and put on his coat. He shook Eleanor's hand. He said, "The first shipment, May 20th. Eleanor said, "It will be ready." He drove back to Brooklyn that afternoon. He stopped once for fuel at a station outside Akron, Ohio, at 3:20 in the afternoon. He stopped once more for coffee and a sandwich at a roadside diner outside Erie, Pennsylvania, at 7 in the evening. He arrived at the Casa de Bufala, receiving Doc on Court Street in Brooklyn, at 12:40 in the morning of April 13, 1986. He carried the signed contract into the shop. He laid it on the cutting table at the back under the work light. He spent the next hour drafting the operational logistics for the first shipment, the refrigerated freight routing, the receiving protocol, the packaging specifications. He did not sleep that night. In the early morning hours of April 13th, sitting at the cutting table at the back of the dark shop with a cup of cold coffee and the April rain on the Court Street window, John Hartley wrote a letter. He wrote it by hand in Italian to his grandmother's grave in a cemetery in Bensonhurst. His grandmother had been born in Campania in 1902 and had died in Brooklyn in 1969, and had made every Sunday morning of John's childhood a fresh mozzarella from whole milk she bought from a dairy on Atlantic Avenue that was the best approximation she could manage in Brooklyn in the 1940s and 1950s of the things she had made at home in Campania before she left. In the letter, he told her that he had found the cheese she had made for him in 1941 when he was 5 years old. He told her where it had come from. He told her about Eleanor Whitfield and the 40-acre farm and the clay starter jars from 1898 and the wooden molds from 1879. He folded the letter into an envelope. He addressed the envelope to the cemetery. He sealed it. He mailed it to the cemetery the next morning. The first shipment left the Whitfield home place by overnight refrigerated freight on the morning of May 20th, 1986, as agreed. The phone call to Daniel came on the evening of April 12th. Eleanor waited until after the 6 o'clock milking. She washed her hands at the barn sink. She walked up to the house. She put a pot of coffee on the stove. She sat down at the kitchen table with the signed contract in front of her and looked at it for a moment, not rereading it, just looking at it, the way you look at something you have been working toward for a long time when it has finally arrived and you are still not quite sure what the feeling is. Then she picked up the telephone and dialed Daniel's apartment number in Lancaster. He answered on the third ring. She said, "I signed a supply contract today. A specialty cheese buyer from Brooklyn, 300 pounds per week, $22 a pound, 5 years exclusive. Annual revenue comes to $343,000. There was a silence on the line that lasted several seconds. Daniel said, "Mom." She said nothing. He said, "When does it start?" She said, "May 20th, first shipment." There was another silence, shorter this time. Then he said, "I'm going to give my notice on Monday." Eleanor said, "You don't have to do that." Daniel said, "Yes, I do." She said, "Think about it over the weekend." He said, "I've been thinking about it since 1979. I'll call you Monday after I talk to the bank." He called on Monday afternoon. He had given his notice that morning. The bank manager, a man named Howard Draper, who had been present at enough of the Whitfield family's financial decisions over the previous 15 years to have strong opinions about all of them, had called it a mistake. He had said, "Daniel, you have a future here. You are leaving a stable position to go work on a water buffalo dairy. I am telling you professionally that I think this is a serious error in judgment." Daniel had nodded. He had thanked Howard Draper for 4 years of employment. He had shaken his hand. He had walked out of the Farmers and Savings Bank at 4:20 on the afternoon of September 25, 1986, and had gotten into his truck and driven directly to the Whitfield home place. He did not stop anywhere on the way. He did not return to the bank. He moved his full labor back to the home place by the end of the month. Eleanor did not make a ceremony of his return. She had not made a ceremony of his departure either. There was work to do, and there had always been work to do. She showed him the expanded production schedule, the increase in milking animals she had been engineering since May, the new refrigeration capacity she had added to the parlor north wall, the additional cheese vat she had acquired in July from a Pittsburgh commercial kitchen auction. She showed him the logistics she had worked out for the first Casa de Bufala shipment and the subsequent weekly schedule. She showed him the production protocols she had written out longhand over the summer, incorporating everything she had refined in the cheese-making process since 1979, every adjustment to temperature and timing and stretch duration that had made the product better. He read the protocols at the kitchen table that first evening back. He asked 4 questions. She answered them. He went to bed. He was in the cheese kitchen at 4:30 the next morning. By the spring of 1987, Daniel Whitfield was running the basement cheese kitchen as senior cheesemaker, responsible for the full production cycle from curd formation through final packing. He was drawing a full-time salary from the operation. He was earning in a single month what the bookkeeping position had paid him in a quarter. He was 29 years old, and he knew with the quiet certainty that comes from being very good at something that matters exactly what he was doing and why. Eleanor sold off the Holstein herd at a partial liquidation auction in March of 1987. The milk hauler from the Lancaster County Cooperative stopped coming. The last Holstein left the home place on the last day of March in the back of a livestock trailer that was taking the animals to a large commercial dairy near Harrisburg that was still in 1987, trying to make the commodity Holstein model work in a collapsing commodity milk market. Eleanor watched the trailer leave from the south gate of the upper pasture. She did not watch it for long. She turned around and walked back to the cheese kitchen. The entire 40 acres became water buffalo pasture by the summer of 1987. The operation was, by the autumn of that year, the largest American water buffalo mozzarella producer east of the Rocky Mountains, supplying Casa de Bufala in Brooklyn under the 5-year exclusive contract and reserving a portion of weekly production for the original Cleveland and Pittsburgh Italian-American specialty network that Eleanor had spent 8 years building and had no intention of abandoning. The federal dairy termination program signed in late 1985 had removed 19 Lancaster County commercial Holstein dairies from production between January and December of 1986. The Class 1 milk price at the Philadelphia Federal Milk Marketing Order had dropped from $15 per hundredweight in 1985 to under $12 by the autumn of 1986 and was still declining. The regional commercial Holstein dairy industry was by every available measure in the worst structural decline since the early 1920s. Victor Strand's 600-acre Holstein operation, Gordon Parrish's brother-in-law, the largest commercial dairy in Lancaster County, had filed for an emergency operating note refinance at the Farmers and Savings Bank in October of 1986. Howard Draper had granted a one-year extension with reduced collateral coverage and had told Victor privately that a second refinance would not be available without additional collateral. Victor had reduced his milking herd by 60 head to cut operating costs. The reduction had reduced his revenue further. The math was not working. By the end of 1988, the Whitfield Water Buffalo cheese operation was grossing $41,000 per month against a total annual revenue of approximately $386,000 on 40 acres. In the same year, Victor Strand's 600-acre Holstein operation grossed approximately $340,000 on 15 times the acreage. The contrast was by the end of 1988, the dominant unspoken subject at the Birchfield Diner, at the Lancaster County Dairy Producers Association meetings, at the Farmers and Savings Bank, and at the First Lutheran Church potluck dinners. It was unspoken because the people who would have needed to speak it were the same people who had said in 1978 that what Eleanor was doing was not a business decision. They did not need to say it aloud. The numbers said it. Gordon Parrish had been watching for 10 years. He had been watching with the patient, worried attention of a man who has made a professional determination and who has spent the subsequent decade watching the world decline to confirm it. He had told himself through 1979 and 1980 and 1981 that the cheese revenue was hobby income. He had told himself through 1982 and 1983 that the commodity milk price decline would eventually force the 40 acres to restructure. He had told himself through 1984 and 1985 that the Casa de Bufala contract, when he finally heard about it in the spring of 1986 through his brother-in-law's banker, was probably unsustainable, that a Brooklyn specialty shop was not a real market anchor, that it would fold or renegotiate or find a cheaper supplier within a year. He had been wrong about all of it. He drove to the Whitfield gate on a cold Saturday afternoon in early November of 1988. He parked his truck on the gravel shoulder of the county road. He sat in the cab for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel and the engine off, and the November air coming in cold through the window sill. He could see the upper pasture from the truck, the water buffalo herd spread across the rolling field, the slate-gray animals moving slowly in the November light. The bull at the far fence line near the salt block, the same as he had been the first time Gordon had stopped on this road 10 years ago. He had been wrong then. He had known by 1986 that he had been wrong. He had known by 1984, if he was honest, which he was finally trying to be. He had come here today, not because there was any practical reason to come, not because it would change the numbers, or restore his professional assessment, or undo the 10 years of incorrect prediction. He had come because Ruth had told him the previous evening at the kitchen table that there were some things a man had to do on foot, not by telephone, not by letter, not by waiting for the right occasion to arise naturally. He got out of the truck. He walked to the gate and unlatched it and walked through across the gravel yard to the milking parlor. Eleanor had come out of the cheese kitchen with her tally book under her arm when she heard the truck. She was standing in the gravel yard when Gordon came around the corner of the parlor building. She watched him walk across the yard toward her. He stopped a few feet away from her. He took off his faded olive-green ball cap. He held it against his chest with both hands. He looked at the cap for a moment, then at the ground, then at Eleanor. He said, "Eleanor." She waited. He said, "I have been thinking about this visit for 2 years. I have been thinking about Norman. I have been thinking about what I should have said in September of 1978 when you walked those first 6 water buffalo into the back pasture. I am here today because I know what I should have said, and I have known it since at least the spring of 1979 when you sold that first cheese to the Cleveland Deli and I stood at the diner counter and told people it was hobby income. I told myself that for 6 more years after that. I told myself a lot of things that I told myself because I am the kind of man I have always been." He stopped. He looked at Eleanor with the direct, unguarded expression of a man who has spent a long time being wrong and has finally stopped pretending otherwise. He said, "I am not here to ask forgiveness. I am not here to explain myself. I am here to ask if I can come stand at this gate one Saturday afternoon a season and learn what I should have learned in 1978. That is what I am asking." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Gordon, you are forgiven. You were forgiven on the evening Ruth sent you over here in October of 1978 when you came to this gate and asked me what I had done and listened to my answer and then drove home without doing anything worse than telling me you were going to watch what happened. That is not an offense that needs 10 years to forgive. You did not need to come today." Gordon said, "I did need to come today, Eleanor." She looked at him for another moment. She unlatched the inner gate. She held it open. She said, "Then come walk the pasture." He came in. They walked the lower pasture and then the upper pasture, in the cold November light, Eleanor with her tally book, and Gordon with his hands in his coat pockets and his cap back on his head. He did not speak much. He looked at the herd with the slow, systematic attention of a man who has been looking at dairy animals all his life, but differently now, as though he were seeing them for the first time, without the overlay of everything he had previously decided about them. He watched the bull cross the lower fence line to the salt block. He looked at the 3-year-olds from the most recent breeding cycle, and at the older animals from the original herd, and at the particular quality of the late November pasture grass that the water buffalo had been conditioning with their grazing pattern for a decade. Eleanor handed him the tally book when they reached the upper fence line. He took it without speaking. He read 3 pages, the weekly production numbers, the herd rotation schedule, the current milking roster with individual animal production records. He gave the book back. They walked back to the gate at dusk in silence. Gordon stopped at the gate. He took off his cap again. He said, "I will come back Saturday." Eleanor said, "Come when you can." He drove home. The following Saturday he came back. He arrived at 8 in the morning and walked the pasture with Eleanor for an hour. He helped Daniel with the afternoon cheese packing. He asked questions about the curd temperature, about the stretch duration, about the Friday shipping protocol. Eleanor and Daniel answered the questions without ceremony in the same practical tone they used for everything. Gordon listened. He did not offer opinions. He was not there to give opinions. He was there to learn, which is a different thing and harder for some people than others. The Saturday after that, he came back again. By the end of November 1988, Gordon Parrish had come 4 consecutive Saturdays to the Whitfield home place. The visits had become in both families, the Whitfields and the Parrishes, a thing that was understood and not discussed. Ruth Parrish did not ask Gordon what he did on Saturday mornings. Eleanor did not mention the visits to anyone. Daniel acknowledged Gordon's presence by putting out an extra coffee cup on the kitchen counter before 8. The Saturday visits continued until Gordon Parrish's death in 2006. The Birchfield Weekly Record noted them in his obituary, 700 words, on the back of the front section, the headline reading, "Gordon Parrish, 87, Lancaster County, Cooperative Extension, Agent retired." The obituary mentioned in its final paragraph that in the last 18 years of his life, Gordon Parrish had spent Saturday mornings at the Whitfield Water Buffalo Farm in the manner of a man completing a long education that had begun by his own account too late. The Lancaster Weekly Record ran a feature on the Whitfield operation in its edition of November 22, 1988, under the headline, "The 6 Buffalo That Changed the County." The article was 8 column inches on the front page and continued for 16 more inside with 3 photographs. The upper pasture in the November light, Eleanor at the cheese kitchen stretching table, and Daniel at the loading dock on a Friday morning with a wooden crate. Silvio Ricci was quoted. He had known Eleanor since 1975 and had been selling her olive oil and taking her mozzarella on referral to Cleveland Italian grocers since the early 1980s. He said, "I knew what she was making the first time she brought me a piece to taste. I told my cousins in Cleveland. My cousins told their restaurant friends. That is how it works in our trade. The cheese tells the story. Dr. Carol Faber at Penn State was quoted. She said, "We have known about the Whitfield operation since the spring of 1984. Mrs. Whitfield asked us to keep her name out of the literature. We did. We are no longer going to because the academic record deserves to be corrected." The Whitfield operation is the foundation of documented American water buffalo dairy production. It is as far as we have been able to measure the largest American water buffalo, mozzarella de bufala operation east of the Rocky Mountains. It has been quietly run for 10 years by a single Lancaster County widow on 6 imported animals she bought from a Vermont breeder on the basis of a kitchen conversation she had with her grandmother in 1937. Gordon Parrish was quoted. He said, "I owe this woman my county's history. I spent 10 years being the man in this county who said she was wrong. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the forgiveness she gave me in November of 1988 without my asking." The article noted in its final paragraph that the Whitfield operation had grossed $386,000 in 1988 on 40 acres, that the Casa de Bufala supply contract had been renewed in March of 1988 at a base price of $24 per pound, and that the American Dairy Goat Association had filed a formal request with the United States Department of Agriculture to establish a federal recognition category for American-produced water buffalo dairy products. The article did not note, because Eleanor had not told the reporter, that the wooden mozzarella molds her grandmother Vera's great-grandfather, Tommaso, had cut from Italian alder in 1879 were still in daily use in the Whitfield cheese kitchen in 1988. That the 3 clay starter culture jars her grandmother had carried, sealed in a steerage trunk across the Atlantic in 1898, had been refreshed every 6 months for 90 consecutive years without a single cross to any commercial culture strain. That the 6 water buffalo Eleanor had walked off a borrowed livestock trailer in the September dark of 1978 had been the foundation of every drop of authentic American mozzarella de bufala produced east of the Mississippi for the decade that followed, and that this had happened not because of any particular plan or market insight or entrepreneurial calculation, but because a 14-year-old girl had crossed an ocean in 1898 with 7 wooden molds and 3 clay jars and 1 sentence, and had handed the sentence to her daughter, and her daughter had handed it to Eleanor, and Eleanor had listened. The Casa de Bufala supply contract ran from May of 1986 through 2005. Eleanor renewed the original 5-year agreement 3 times in 1991, in 1996, and in 2001. John Hartley drove the 470 miles from Brooklyn each time for the renewal signing in the same dark gray Lincoln Town Car until 1998, in a dark blue one after that. He always arrived at 6 in the morning. Eleanor always had the mozzarella on the table by 11. Between 1989 and 1998, Eleanor trained 5 Lancaster County dairywomen in the Lombard family cheesemaking method, the full method from milking protocol through curd formation to the stretch technique and the wooden mold shaping, and the aging room conditions. She charged none of them tuition of any kind. She had been taught for free by her grandmother Vera, who had been taught for free by her own mother, who had been taught for free by her grandmother Lucia. The knowledge had never been sold. Eleanor was not going to start. The 5 women she trained were Margaret Draper of Birchfield, Lena Burkhart of Strasbourg, Clara Osterfeld of Quarryville, Ingrid Mast of Ephrata, and Ruth Scheller of Elizabethtown. Each of them had come to Eleanor's gate in the way that serious people come to serious things, not by appointment or advertisement, but by word of mouth, by the reputation of the product, by the particular kind of attention that a person pays to something that is genuinely better than anything else in its category. Margaret Draper came first in the spring of 1989. She was 34 years old, ran a small Holstein operation with her husband on 28 acres north of Birchfield, and had been buying Eleanor's mozzarella through the Lancaster County Italian grocer since 1983. She had tasted the cheese and had understood what it was, and had spent 6 years wondering whether she could learn to make it. She came to the gate on a March morning and asked. Eleanor opened the gate. She spent 3 months working alongside Eleanor and Daniel in the cheese kitchen mornings before the rest of her day began Saturdays, when her husband could manage the Holstein milking alone. By the end of the summer, she could stretch and form the curd correctly. By the autumn, she was making acceptable product on her own. By the following spring, she had placed a breeding order for her first 4 water buffalo from Harlan Voss in Vermont. Lena Burkhart came in 1991. Clara Osterfeld and Ingrid Mast came together in 1993. Ruth Scheller came in 1997. Each of them established working water buffalo dairies of their own small operations, 10 to 30 milking animals making mozzarella in the Lombard method, using cultures derived from Eleanor's own starter stock, refreshed in the continuous line from the 1898 jars, selling to the same Italian-American specialty networks in the Northeast Ohio and Western Pennsylvania region that Eleanor had spent the 1980s building. By the mid-1990s, the 5 operations, together with the Whitfield home place, formed what regional food writers would later call the Central Pennsylvania Water Buffalo Mozzarella Corridor, a cluster of small, serious, family-run dairy operations across Lancaster, York, Chester, and Dauphin counties, all making the same product in the same method from the same cultural lineage, the whole thing traceable, in the end, to a 14-year-old girl from Lombardy with 7 wooden molds and a sentence in her mouth. By the end of Eleanor's career at the home place, the Whitfield water buffalo herd had grown to 170 head. The operation had supplied foundation breeding stock to 14 working buffalo mozzarella dairies across 9 states: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Vermont, and North Carolina. The total American Mediterranean water buffalo dairy herd, traceable to the original 6 animals Eleanor had bought from Harlan Voss in September of 1978, numbered by the most careful available count over 400 animals at the end of the 1990s. The Casa de Bufala shop on Court Street in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn is still in business today. It moved to a slightly larger storefront in 2003, but kept the same address and the same name and the same cutting table at the back of the shop, where John Hartley laid the signed contract on the night of April 12, 1986. The shop carries, among other products, fresh mozzarella de bufala, made by a succession of Whitfield-trained producers that traces without interruption back to the original Whitfield production protocol. The wooden mozzarella molds, all 7 of them, the ones Tommaso Bonetti cut from Italian alder in 1879, and that Vera Bonetti carried in the bottom of her steerage trunk to New York Harbor in 1898, and that Eleanor's hands closed around for the first time on an April morning in a Lancaster County basement kitchen in 1979, are now displayed in a glass-fronted oak cabinet at the American Cheese Society headquarters in Denver, Colorado. Beside the cabinet hangs a small framed black and white photograph. It is a cabinet card portrait, the kind made by traveling village photographers who moved across the European countryside in the late 19th century with glass plate cameras documenting the families who were leaving for America. The photographer's name was Pietro Comini, and he had traveled through the villages of the Lombard Plain in the spring of 1898, photographing the departing emigrants. In the photograph, a girl of 14 stands before the front step of a stone farmhouse somewhere in the Lombard countryside outside Milan in May of 1898. She stands straight, her hands at her sides, her face serious and young and composed in the particular way of someone who has just been told to hold still and is doing so. Behind her, through the open farmhouse door, the edge of a kitchen table is barely visible, and on the table just at the edge of the frame, the dim shapes of what might be small, round wooden objects arranged in a row. The label below the photograph reads in hand-lettered cursive, Vera Bonetti, May, 1898, carrying her grandmother's molds to America. Eleanor Whitfield farmed the home place for 19 more years after the 1988 contract renewal. She ran the morning milking herself until 2001 when she was 70 years old, and then handed the milking routine to Daniel and continued to oversee the cheese kitchen until the spring of 2004 when she formally turned the operation over to Daniel and moved into the Birchfield house that had belonged to her mother, Adelheid, and before that to Vera Bonetti, and where the back porch looked out over the same kitchen garden where Eleanor had sat on a summer evening in 1937 and heard the sentence for the first time. She lived in the house for 8 more years. She died in the spring of 2012 at the age of 81 in the back bedroom on a morning in April when the light across Lancaster County was the particular clean pale gold of early spring. Daniel ran the operation for 12 years after Eleanor's retirement. He passed it to his own daughter, Vera Whitfield, named for her great-great-grandmother in 2016. Vera Whitfield runs it today, 40 acres. The same rolling Lancaster County field water buffalo descended in unbroken line from the 6 animals her great-grandmother bought from Harlan Voss on the morning of September 2, 1978, for $4,800 in cash. The wooden molds in Denver are on loan from the Whitfield family. The 3 clay starter jars are not in Denver. They are in the basement kitchen of the Whitfield home place. They are still sealed with beeswax. They are still in use. They have been refreshed every 6 months without interruption since 1898. That is 126 years. The culture is alive. Eleanor Whitfield never explained publicly why she chose the breed. There was no mystery in it, no hidden calculation, no secret insight. The reason was exactly what it appeared to be, a sentence spoken on a farmhouse porch in Lancaster County in the summer of 1937 by an old woman who had carried it across 4,000 miles of ocean from a Lombard farmhouse kitchen in 1898. The sentence had been given to Eleanor at the age of 6, and she had carried it for 41 years. And when the conditions the sentence described had been met, when the American market was ready, when the Brooklyn cheese trade was desperate for a domestic supply, when the dairy commodity market had declined sufficiently to make 40 acres of Holstein production insufficient, Eleanor had acted on it. She had not acted on it in haste. She had not acted on it dramatically or publicly or with any expectation of recognition. She had acted on it in the only way the sentence had ever suggested it should be acted upon: quietly, carefully, with good animals and clean equipment and the right wooden molds and a living culture that had not been broken in 90 years, getting up at 5 in the morning every morning and doing the work. That was all. That was everything. 40 acres, 6 water buffalo, $4,800 in cash. A sentence in an old woman's mouth on a summer evening in 1937. The breed nobody wanted. In the hands of the woman nobody understood, until they tasted what her grandmother had taught her to make.